Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Kate Nielsen. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Legal Advocacy for AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund. Since its first meeting in 1881, AAUW has been a catalyst for change. Together, through our coordinated and strategic advocacy, we've enacted invaluable legislation at the federal, state, and local levels. Involvement in the political process is always important, but especially in this crucial election year. Here at the AAUW Action Fund, we encourage individuals to get involved by educating themselves and others about the issues at stake and where the candidates stand on them. And we're here to help you with that. AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund are nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean we're not political. And tonight, we're going to talk about how you can get involved and the resources that we have to assist you. Before we jump in, I'm going to turn it over to Nakia to talk about the Equity Network and some housekeeping notes.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining our Equity Network webinar. I'm Nakia, the Engagement Associate here at AAUW, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. If you tuned into a previous webinar, we're really glad to have you back. For those of you who are here for the first time, the Equity Network was established by AAUW for people who want to champion equity and inclusion on their campuses, in their workplaces, and in their communities. We created this network as a space for open discussion and learning about the issues that matter the most to you, and to connect you with the resources that can help you affect meaningful change. I hope this program is helpful to you, and you leave this webinar with a deeper understanding of your rights as a voter. You can direct any questions about the program to the Q&A box below. And if you have any technical questions that we can help you with, please direct those to our panelists in the chat box. I'm turning this back over to my colleague Kate, who will be kicking off today's program. Please enjoy.
Thanks so much, Nakia. And if we can advance to the next slide. So now I'd like to introduce tonight's speakers. Robin Lucas is the Grassroots Advocacy Manager for AAUW and the AAUW Action Fund, and Letty Bustillos is our Federal Policy Manager. Together, they're going to walk through the important components of the upcoming election and how you can get involved. They'll discuss voting access, getting out the vote, and voter education. Then we'll take some questions and conclude with new and forthcoming resources. As Nakia said, please use the chat box for technical questions and the Q&A option for substantive questions. We'll have our speakers weigh in as we go. So with that, let's jump in. Robin?
Thank you, Kate and Nakia. Hello, everyone. I'm Robin. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I want to welcome you to voter access and education during the COVID-19 pandemic. Tonight, let's start by talking about the overarching voter issue of access. This is a rapidly shifting reality that varies state by state, so tonight will be a general review of the history and current state of access throughout the country. We want to operate tonight with two key messages in mind. One, our constitutional rights do not pause during a public crisis. And two, there's no one approach fits all access to voting, so we need to prioritize expanding options for voting and not shifting the one option folks have to something else. Next slide. Nope, next slide again. Sorry about that. Here we go. Tonight we're going to talk about how to make progress on these important issues and move forward. As we go through the webinar, I challenge you to think about what your voting experience has been and why. Voting access is a combination of the laws and rights in your area and your particular ability to practice them. Doing the work to constructively and intentionally understand your experience in the greater context of voting access will help you tailor your get out the vote efforts and message for your area. Voter suppression has existed since the birth of this nation, and it comes in both new and old forms. The disenfranchisement of voters continues under the guise of restrictions claiming to prevent voter fraud, even though voter fraud is repeatedly studied and proven to be a rare occurrence. I understand that there are different viewing experiences and abilities tonight between computer and phone and more, so with a small font here, I'll read out both lists. On the left side, we have voting access. This lists out vote by mail, early voting, no excuse absentee voting, online voter registration and voting, and maintained in-person voting with public health precautions in all polling places. Now on the right side, we have voter suppression. This can include voter identification requirements, voter registration record purges, a lack of access and flexibility on voting, closure of polling places, and this is in predominantly Black counties, and finally, and most recently, maintaining voting schedules without ensuring public health protections. So let's talk about the role that you can play as individuals and how we can harness our collective power to protect the right to vote and mobilize people to exercise that right. But first, let's take a step back and review the history and evolution of access with my colleague, Letty. Next slide.
Thanks, Robin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Letty, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm very pleased to be here with you discussing this very important issue. Our right to vote has a long and tumultuous history. Protecting that right, one that many have fought long and hard for, continues today as ongoing efforts to suppress our right negates what it means to live in a free democracy. More than a century ago, the 15th Amendment guaranteed the right of all men to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of slavery. 50 years later, in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave some women the right to vote. But it wasn't until 1965, after decades of racially discriminatory practices like literacy tests, poll taxes, and Jim Crow laws, that the right to vote for everyone, free of racial discrimination, was written into law with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In signing the law, President Johnson said, "It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." But despite this landmark legislation, some communities were still unable to equitably access their right to vote. The 1975 amendment to the Voting Rights Act required that all voting materials be made available in multiple languages and ensured the right to vote for Asian Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans. Next slide, please. Broadly speaking, the Voting Rights Act made any election law and/or practice that discriminated and prevented anyone from voting against the law. Two critical provisions, Sections 4 and 5, gave teeth to the law. Section 4 of the VRA provides what is known as a coverage formula that identifies states with a history of unlawful, racially discriminatory election laws and practices. In 1965, immediately after the VRA was enacted, states covered under this formula included Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Virginia, and other localities. Section 5 of the VRA required the states who were identified by Section 4 to seek out pre-clearance from the Department of Justice before they could enact any new changes to their election laws. That is, the states had to prove to justice that any proposed changes would not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, or language. And in 2006, the Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, and Coretta Scott King Voting Rights Act of 2006 both reaffirmed the country's commitment to the right to vote, but also ensured its protection by extending these two critical provisions for an additional 25 years. However, as you can see on the slide, on June 25, 2013, the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby v. Holder that Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act was unconstitutional because times had changed and the old formula no longer applied. And in finding Section 4 unconstitutional, it also made Section 5 inoperable until Congress develops a new coverage formula that, as the court stated, speaks to current conditions. The immediate results of this ruling were devastating and could be seen within 24 hours. Strict voter ID laws in Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama were passed. There was curtailment of early voting and elimination of same-day registration in North Carolina. All voter suppression tactics that render moot the original intent of the Voting Rights Act. This rollback by the Supreme Court and Congress's inability to break the partisan divide make the right to vote especially precarious during this time of COVID-19. Next slide, please. With the pandemic, the space to abuse is widening. Voter suppression tactics, as Robin described, are evident across multiple states, jeopardizing not only our right to vote, but our ability to stay safe while exercising our rights. To protect our rights, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2019, introduced in both the House and the Senate, aims to provide a new coverage formula as required for Section 4 of the VRA, as well as ensure that no last-minute voting changes will negatively affect voters, as any changes will need to be announced 180 days before an election. And while the recently passed CARES Act provided $400 million in election security grants to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus in the 2020 federal election cycle, experts and advocates alike say it is simply not enough. Estimates suggest that at least $2 billion are needed for states to prepare for accessible and safe elections in November. So where do we go from here? Robin, I hand it back to you to fill us in on what we all can do.
Thank you, Letty. All of this history shows why this work is so important. With that said, here is your first call to action for the night. Now, I know most folks aren't fans of phones these days, but a new perk that I have learned, next slide, thanks. But a new perk I've learned recently is that you don't have to worry about what your face is doing on a phone call like you do on a video, as I've been anxious about this entire webinar. So tonight I have two asks for your phone call. The first is simple. You can figure out how to request an absentee ballot and the relevant deadlines and cutoffs for your area. And the second, call to advocate for expanding access options and ask what is being done in response to the pandemic. On this, we have, it is time to make calls to your Secretary of State, Board of Elections, and Governor. Target your call to the most impactful policymakers. If you do call your elected representative, make sure to use the very magical words, "I'm a constituent." And finally, plan your script. I've written out an example of a script here. You can use the list of options to vote at the beginning of this section to determine just how many that you have access to in your state, and then narrow down where you need to advocate further. Remember that your call really does count. I know it's hard to imagine that calls are still being tallied when offices are all down to essential staff, but they are. My script here is, I'm calling today to ask how the upcoming election will be conducted in our state. As a constituent, I'm concerned about the upcoming elections being conducted safely and accessibly. What is our state doing about voter access during public health crisis? My tip after making a call like that would be post the experience online. Social media is a great follow-up tool, both for the accountability with your elected official or the Board of Elections in your area, and then use it as an educational tool for your communities. Next slide, please. In any other election year, this is where we would talk about get out the vote, or GOTV. In terms of tabling at local events, grocery stores, knocking on doors, and seeing musicians literally rock the vote. So take a deep breath with me, nod that we understand social distancing is the new norm, and let's explore how we can still get out that vote. Next slide. All right, the general get out the vote strategy is to identify your voters and mobilize them. Get out the vote in the before time, we'll call it. Let's start with a series of efforts to register and motivate voters for elections by asking 3 key questions. If they're registered, where their polling place is and how they plan on getting to and from it, and will they commit to voting on the day? Targeted and personal connections have been notified or noticed as the most effective to inspire voters. So in-person efforts have traditionally been prioritized. Like I said, like the door-to-door, tabling somewhere, but get out the vote efforts really are everywhere. Next slide. All right, so get out the vote during COVID-19. While all the get out the vote strategy hasn't changed, the tactics to achieve it have. We have to shift away from those traditional in-person efforts into online, phone, etc. So here we have 3 listed options of what we can still do. The first being phone. I know it's not the same as knocking on someone's door, but phone is a valuable tool in reminding folks to register and then turn out. This is by either phone or text banking together virtually. These, again, traditionally banking would happen with like a pizza party in person. You can still do that digitally on Zoom. Everyone can have pizza safely in their homes, and that you could still text bank with people. Second is you can conduct your postcard or letter writing campaign still and just use a no contact drop off for supplies with volunteers. What is a postcard campaign, you ask? Some Get Out the Vote efforts have had pre-printed materials that they'll drop off to volunteers or groups of volunteers where they have a party or they fill out the postcards together. And this gives the opportunity to have a personalized section in a template where you write why you're voting, why it's important for your community for someone to get out the vote, and use that targeted personal connection to motivate somebody. The added benefit of this being utilized still is that you can support USPS in this time as well. And the third being social media. Social media, it's my immediate go-to. I'll confirm for you now your sneaking suspicion. We will forever be talking about social media. I think that's an incredibly useful opportunity to get out that vote, and with the added benefit of not just having a printout pamphlet that you're handing to people, but actually directly hyperlinking them somewhere. Finally, be kind to yourself. Remember that your Get Out the Vote efforts truly are important now more than ever, and you can channel your energies in a productive way if you remember this really is a marathon year and not a sprint. Next slide, please. So tonight's call to action for Get Out the Vote is to host a voter registration drive online. Registering voters is best done through direct, personal, and targeted contact. That said, we can get creative with the online aspect of it. This could include messaging posted on social media, or hosting live videos on your platforms, engaging directly with people in the Zoom happy hours and social events that people are still being invited to virtually. I have 4 tips here to remember if you are going to go that route. First, be prepared with links to your state's voter registration information and rules. 2, partner with coalition members. You can check in on what popular hashtags are trending today, if there are online campaigns already being conducted, or if a drive is going to be happening soon. 3, like I said, keep your messaging personal and direct. And then 4, just like we're doing with our hand washing, wash, rinse, repeat, do it again and again and again. Get Out the Vote efforts really do come in waves with primaries and general elections, so repeating your efforts is productive. And if you have one, include an anecdote about something memorable. For example, next slide. So here we have a picture of me. I just tweeted this out about an hour ago. Back in 2016, I was caught in a voter registration purge in Washington, D.C., and was mortified to not have noticed it until Election Day. Thankfully, Washington, D.C. does have same-day voter registration, so it was just a tedious wait in an extra long line instead of prohibitive for my vote. But I was then late to work, and I could have missed out on voting altogether. Now, I make sure to have everyone in my networks, even other Get Out the Vote organizers, especially us, make sure that everyone's checked our status by our area's cutoffs if we have one. Notice in this post, I used a trending hashtag. Throwback Thursday is always popular, as well as including and linking to my local Board of Elections. Also, I used an adorable photo of baby me the day I first registered to vote, and precious, nerdy, hopefully memorable, hopefully effective. Here's your best example. Next slide, please. All right, so the idea of getting out the vote while so much is in upheaval is a daunting one, I will admit. We have a true opportunity right now, though, to build direct conversations in our communities on specific voter issues, to then later mobilize for Get Out the Vote efforts. Next slide. Here we have 3 resources for voter education. I know you're only seeing 2. I promise there are 3. First one, though, the 2020 Voter Issue Guide is now up on our website. Our Voter Issue Guide provides background, key buzzwords, and suggested questions on 6 key issues for 2020. We have prioritized this year voter access, no surprise, pay equity, paid sick and family leave, college affordability, campus sexual harassment and violence, and finally, healthcare access and reproductive rights. You can find all of this on AAUW as well as AAUWaction.org. The second one on the right here is 2 templates. That's why I say there are 3. We have the head-to-head voter guides. This is an availability for you to assess candidates across key issues. The templates are structured for both federal and state races and are available on the AAUW Action Fund website in Word format for you to download and use on any and all of your specific races. Next slide. Finally, for this section, my call to action for you is to host a conversation on an issue. Hosting an issue forum can be a panel discussion with experts, a teletown hall with a candidate, or a conversation within your social networks. Regardless of the format that you choose, you want to remember to invite targeted participants and ask them to invite their friends, prepare remarks to introduce the topic, research candidate stances in your areas, and ask prepared questions or conversation starters. With these formats, also remember to think, what platforms do you find useful, what would work best for your audience, and are experts or candidates helpful to hear from, or do you need a more intimate conversation with your networks for that topic? Next slide. So here we're going to pause. Kate, Nakia, would you care to share if there are any questions coming in from the Q&A section?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much, Robin. First question I have is, on one of your first slides, you talked about access. And I'm curious, given our current health crisis and many of the obstacles that folks are facing and precautions that we're all supposed to be taking, why is it important to maintain in-person voting?
Absolutely. I know that a lot of candidates, rightfully so, or a lot of advocates, rightfully so, are focusing on expanding mail-in, like the vote-by-mail options. And while that is great and does expand access and safety with voting, there are a lot of people out there who do not have traditional postal codes to mail to and from. There are also a lot of people who, for example, folks who live on reservations who have different access to like a PO box versus a postcode. So like that is not as accessible for them. There are also a lot of folks who getting to and from dropping off mail is not physically accessible. So that doesn't really make it easier for people. Letty, do you have any impact? Want to bring some other folks in for answering questions?
Yeah, so I think when we think about the history of voting, when we think about how historically marginalized communities were prevented from actually going to the polls, whether it was through actual physical violence, economic intimidation, any number of things that prevented them from going to the polls, them being able to physically go to a poll, cast their ballot, really can be seen as an act of resistance. And so, especially for older generations who were in fact part of these movements like Bloody Sunday, the march, from where Martin Luther King, John Lewis were present, the 1975 voting, the amendment to the Voting Rights Act was a direct result of Mexican Americans' experiences in the Southwest and Texas in particular, where they were physically prevented from voting. So I think for a particular generation, just the physical act of going to the polls, voting, is so significant that we really cannot take it away, in addition to all the reasons why, Robin, what you stated.
Great, thank you both. Another question is it too early to encourage others to ask for absentee ballots? Or should we wait for some of our towns to figure out vote by mail options first?
I don't think it's too early at all. I am in the process of requesting my own pretty much as we speak. That is my project by the end of this week. So I do urge everyone to go out, look into what their absentee ballot request process and access is, and get those requests out.
Great. For phone banking or postcarding, phone numbers and addresses are needed. Do you have a resource to get local contacts?
Ooh, that is a good question. I know that there are a lot of organizations out there that specialize in facilitating that. Kate, do you have any specific ones that you would recommend?
I would say that this is a great place to tap into local coalitions and see who is being targeted, who needs to be targeted. This is also a great place to work with different parties. So the DNC or the RNC or other parties might have that information about who needs to be targeted depending on which candidates you're interested in working with. Let's see. Next question is, vote by mail options are available in a handful of states now. Do we have other states where a grassroots campaign on this issue would be especially productive?
Yes. I do urge everyone to look into their own state because it is most effective to be advocating as a constituent and resident of that state. But there are a lot of states who don't have vote by mail still. So looking up which states you are adjacent to or have ties to would be very useful. And folks do need the help.
And there's a lot of resources around on that. I saw one just yesterday. NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislators, had a nice roundup of which states have those provisions on the books already and which ones don't. Next question is a little bit more general, I think in response to our last answer, but I think broadly applicable. How do you get connected with quote unquote coalition members? How do we find out who to work with in our area and getting out the vote? Robin, do you have suggestions on that?
I would suggest that you reach out to your local state AAUW and ask them who they're already working with. They can make more connections and give you the lay of the land and direct you to really helpful coalition members.
Great. On the candidate issue guides that you were talking about, how would you recommend going about filling those out? What research would you look to be able to figure out candidates' positions?
Absolutely. That's a really understandable question. And for that reason, we do have it actually written on the template for you to give you a little guide. But candidates' positions can be determined using their legislative records, public statements, and campaign position papers, as well as published information from credible news sources.
Great. And earlier in the presentation, you talked about voter fraud and that being a little bit of a misnomer. Can you say, excuse me, can you say anything more about that?
Absolutely. There are a lot of people out there, both politicians and other leaders who like to respond to the demand of expanding voter access options with, but what if that is abused? They will cite voter fraud as the number one reason that those options are like insecure. And I just want to say that voter fraud is repeatedly studied and is not found to exist on a countrywide issue, let alone the states that also specifically say that they have a problem. The studies that have been done in the past 12 years have found that the actual impersonation and voter fraud rates are outweighed by your likelihood to be struck by lightning. And I believe that there are only 31 actual credible convictions of credible claims for voter fraud in the past 8 years, I believe. So it's more a talking point against voter access options than a reality.
Thanks, Robin. Just had another question that in years past, AAUW Action Fund has produced targeted congressional guides on races for some toss-ups and other notable races. I'm wondering if we'll be doing so again. That will very much depend on how the next few months go and resources and capacity. We hope to, but I don't want to make any promises, and I encourage everyone to fill them out themselves for contested races in their area. We also received a number of questions that have been responded to in the chat in the Q&A box, but I just wanted to flag for those who are curious. This is being recorded and the slides will be available. And so that will all be sent out in a follow-up email. Are there other questions? There have been some really great informative ones that have been asked already. Really appreciate everyone's engagement. Great, just one more came in. More generally, how would you recommend we emphasize to people that this issue should be prioritized? People in the media are naturally more focused on the public health and economic consequences of the pandemic than voting. Robin, do you have ideas on that? Maybe some of your little social media juju?
Absolutely. It's really tough to pivot conversation and focus in what is seen as taking focus away from the pandemic related issues. I would respond with challenging folks that getting out the vote and educating yourself as a voter for 2020 is a pandemic related issue. It's completely related. I mean, all of the responses we're experiencing and watching unfold in live time are directly impacted by our elected officials and who is making decisions. So I would tie whatever conversation you're in with people or you're seeing online and say, this is a reason why you need to vote. Yep.
A few other just sort of comments have come in to the same point that you were just making, that this is a public health issue. And also a link to a study about criticisms of voting by mail being unfounded, and I've mentioned that several other states have successfully run campaigns with mail-in ballots despite similar criticism.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was a really interesting and informative discussion. Should we go to the next slide for some wrap up?
Yep. All right. So here we have two more resources. On the left, we have the 2-Minute Activist. This is, as it says, you provide the voice, we'll provide the megaphone. If you sign up for this, we only utilize it when we know that your voice will be impactful and informed. So you can sign up for that on AAUW.org. And on the right, we have more voter registration tools, especially if you would like to follow my request to host a voter registration drive. That is on AAUWaction.org under voter registration. And we have more materials and toolkits that will be coming soon, including, no surprise, a social media toolkit to use from the Action Fund website as well. And with that, next slide. I do want to overall thank everyone for becoming a part of the Equity Network in this important election year. We'd love to work together in the future to advance our shared goals. And with that, stay tuned for our next webinar on Voting Access and Education 201. Nikia.
Thank you, Robin. And thank you all again for tuning in. I hope that the information you received was both helpful and empowering, especially now as voter access is threatened by COVID-19. We want to continue this important work with more programs like this one that empower people to advocate for themselves and their communities. But please keep in mind that we are a nonprofit and our work is not possible without the support of people like you who care about these issues. If you like this program and want to continue to see more resources like this available, please consider being a part of the Equity Network by making a contribution to AAUW. We suggest a $50 gift, but we are grateful for whatever you might be able to afford during these times. I'll be following up with everyone in attendance with a link to donate, a brief survey, and a link to our Equity Network webpage that includes our webinar recordings, so stay tuned. I appreciate you all joining us tonight. We hope you'll tune in again for future Equity Network webinars. Have a good night and stay safe.